Today we're going to speak to Pranay Lal. Absolutely an honor to speak to you, Pranay. And as you know from the earlier conversations, to those who visit the website, there's a whole page which will be devoted to Pranay with his detailed CV and things he'd like to share with us. But I'd like to just briefly introduce Pranay as an outstanding person who I sort of reintroduced to through his two books, Indica and Invisible Empires, two extraordinary books, and we'll be speaking about both of them in a bit. But these books actually tell a very big story about us human beings in deep geological time, but across also those living beings we actually don't even think about, but we only encounter in a very negative way, like viruses or microbes. He makes us think about both of these in very different ways than I have done before. So we look forward to a really exciting conversation, because the relocation of us in our temporal and spatial context, this is so critical to us to think of us where we are today as a species. What does the planet mean to us, and what we are in this whole schema of evolution? You know, are we this extraordinary top of the chain species, or we are a part of a very large web of life? So I'm just going to start with a triggering conversation, triggering questions, Pranay, and of course we'll evolve the conversation as time goes, as it evolves. But just as an opening question, how should we think of evolution? You know, and we are part of that whole schema of deep time, and we are here. And who are we in that whole schema of things? Did we come because the dinosaurs disappeared, or is there a more complex thing going on here? And what happens to us in the future? So if you'd like to reflect on that through your writings and any whatever way you want to, and then we go to other questions.
Right. Thank you, Ravi, first of all, for inviting me to this very exciting forum that you've created. And I think, this is, the next hour or so, then we're going to, jab around and, look at how we engage on, diverse things from deep time to something as contemporary as COVID, the COVID pandemic that we're facing now. So I think the swathe of time can't be broader and bigger and more complex than what we can imagine. So, like you said, I think for me the driving forces of evolution are very critical, and they define the whole tempo in which evolution is taking place. Evolution takes place around us all the time, and there are species that appear and reappear, disappear. We evolve constantly as well. And I think that's a notion that most biologists, philosophers tend to forget, that the tempo of evolution is affecting different organisms differently at different times. So, like I say in both my books, that to my mind, after the sun and plate tectonics, it's the microbial world that defines how different species are going to evolve and the rate at which they're going to evolve and how they're going to impact evolution in the larger scheme of things. Of course, there's interaction between dominant species and species that they depend on. That kind of complex arrangement, of course, is in play. And I think the focus of most evolutionary biologists has been looking at only the dominant characters or charismatic species in an ecosystem. I think there are lots of upheavals and small upheavals that happen. They're minor turnovers that happen, but they have large consequences over a broad period of time. It may appear that the ecosystem is stable and everything is fine, but there's a lot of churning that's happening that is not so obvious to our eyes. And those kind of obvious things that we see later, I mean, they appear obvious to us, and it's something that has happened deep in time. Just a case in point, if you were to look at a forest, you have creatures that have evolved about 300 million years ago or so. There could be a tree or a plant or a cycad or palm. It's been there for about 250, 300 million years ago, and it's been there for, it's remained rather unchanged, right? But there are creatures like, especially birds, for example. I mean, most bird species that we hear today in and around us in Delhi or wherever we are products of the last glacial age. So we're looking at about a period between 70,000 years and 40,000 years. So imagine that most of the songbirds or the raptors and birds that we take for granted are things that are products of very recent evolution, right? And so if you were to start placing all these things together, you see how important the creatures that evolved millions of years ago, when you posit them against creatures that have just evolved in their comparison just yesterday. And you know how important birds are, for example, for trees. And the tree might have been there earlier. It evolved many, many millions of years earlier. And the birds and the other creatures like the squirrels and other creatures that are there, which depend on them, and they depend on each other. So I think we need to understand the spatial sense. I mean, you're right in saying that it's a temporal and a spatial thing, but the relationship between creatures is constantly evolving. And I think that's what is fascinating. I think even Darwin was fascinated by looking at the finches, for example, and the beetles, and later many other creatures. I mean, he was very interested in understanding. I don't know whether you know the story about Darwin. It's a very interesting one. So he married his cousin, and he knew that consanguineous marriages could result in weaker progeny. So what he started to do was he was looking at various plants, especially plants that had come from South America and Africa and other places. So, and they didn't have pollinators in the garden, right? In the British garden, you don't have pollinators, the wasps, bees, the butterflies that you find in native places from where the plants were sourced. So he would go and take a paintbrush or a toothpick or something that would, he would just instigate the transfer of pollen.
Yeah.
And what he wanted to see was that if related plants that came from the same seed stock, and if they were mated together, would the seeds have the same rigor, or would they have deficiencies? Because that was a question that was bothering him immensely. And that's where he started getting interested in Mendel's work and other people who were looking at inheritance. So I don't know if this side story has any relevance to what you asked me, but I think the second aspect that we have to start looking at is the reason why I say the microbial world is so important is because they are the primary producers of energy, more than trees, plants, and shrubs and other things. And the second thing is important thing about them is that not only do they produce large amount of the photosynthetic material, the glycogen and glucose, but they also produce oxygen as a byproduct. And they are also undertakers of elements and compounds, and create new varieties of chemicals which are so useful for other organisms to feed upon. So I think these factors are some things that we tend to ignore when it comes to the microbial world. And they're so important, because take away one piece of the microbial world and everything in an ecosystem would collapse. And we're seeing this. Yeah. So, for example, there's this in Arizona, there's the spring where there's you've got it's perhaps there are two isolated springs which end in a kind of a pool. And it's devoid of life. That's what it appeared, that it's absolutely devoid of life, and it just has a thick mat of red algae on it. And scientists for a very large period of time thought that these are just toxic pools, because they could possibly be laced with something that's being runoff that's coming from the rocks. It could be arsenic, it could be cadmium, whatever. It could be a trace element that is deterring plants from or even animals to colonize it. But recent microbial studies have shown that actually that's incredible soup of varieties of microbes that are unknown to science. In fact, it's become a project by itself.
Mhm.
To understand those organisms, and they're not just species. They're talking of genus and and genera and families
Wow,
of new kinds of microbes that are unknown to
that's
us.
amazing.
So it's just those two small pools in a rocky landscape, absolutely desolate place that can bring such
So
amazing.
it brings me to my next questions of interrelationships, that between geology and biology, between the physical terrain and the living being, these are not in isolation. They are causing each other in a way, because they are uh, they're not separate. So that the living organism is not separate from the rock it's lying on, and it has this interaction which we don't easily recognize, that these are sort of have some kind of relationship or even co-formations with the physical terrain.
Sure. I mean, I think there are views in which evolutionary biologists have developed the notion of how organic matter or first life evolved, right? So, and there are several theories, and the most recent theory is actually very fascinating. We've heard the oceanic vents and rock pools and places where water meets the sand, and you've got UV light creating the first lipids, and which became the external container in which the RNA formed, right? And it was a very gradual process in which these vacuoles held the primordial genetic material, which became
Mhm.
something kick-started it to create life, became self-replicating life.
Mhm.
A very recent theory has actually been propounded, which says that uh, the first life could have actually emerged in places where you have background radiation, slightly higher background radiation.
Mhm.
And this is fascinating because it meets certain conditions that other evolutionary biologists and people who look at first life or tend to propound on how the first life would have emerged. That has now been, been taken into another plane, and that could as well be a case that we are looking at. So I think what scientists are now understanding is that life would have emerged across the globe
Mhm.
in several ways. And perhaps it started several times in fits and starts and died out and then emerged again. And uh, there would be some life that would have been common across the globe, and there would be some that would have been unique. The second time or the third time, the iterative process in which it got created many times over and over again, it created new types as well. So there would have been some common organisms, life forms that got created, and there would be some new varieties. So right at the beginning of time, when life was being created or was assembling itself, uh, there was diversity that was taking place right at the beginning, because there was things that were setting and resetting the first cells that were coming into existence. So that's fascinating by itself. And what we know is that the elemental process that went behind to create the transfer of energy uh, is perhaps fundamental, because you need to have things that are they're elements and minerals that are going to be toxic for certain creatures as they're forming, right? I mean, the earliest colony, imagine a mat of something growing along a beach or at the oceanic vent or around this radioactive sand that people are positioning as a possible place of where life emerged. You cannot have other deterrents that actually can push back that thing. Of course, that would have happened because you might have a flow of another mineral over it, or another high tide or things like that. The point that I'm making here is that we needed a set of conditions to get these things started. And
Mhm.
the entire globe at the time, the planet, had several such places where this could have emerged.
Right.
And there would be different sets of minerals.
Mhm.
Each volcano has a very different, very distinct signature. They have very different minerals coming out of them.
Mhm.
And just like not every rock is similar, every beach sand across the world is very different. Organisms also would have emerged in a variety of ways, and therefore created a variety of pathways in which they evolved and created new ways. So this is going to be, and we're not going to have a definitive answer, because we can't go back in time. The only thing that we have are fossils and genes and other counterfactual ways in which we can imagine how these processes would have happened. So I think it's extremely fascinating on how scientists engage
Yeah.
and develop these scenarios of how the earliest lives.
So these processes are still ongoing.
Absolutely, absolutely. They will continue to persist, because life is not going to cease no matter what happens.
Mhm.
Life is something that is it just needs the right sequence of assembly of minerals, and those minerals that can transform into creating something which is the first cells. Or again, if everything was irradiated on our planet,
Mhm.
chances are that, of course, there's something that will survive for sure. I mean, not to quote Steven Spielberg,
Mhm.
but or rather Michael Crichton in this case,
Yeah.
Jurassic Park. But you know, life to start again, we've got the essential minerals, and we've
Mhm.
got the elements. We've got UV light. We've got the right amount of gases. Nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, even methane. I mean, although methane is a deadly gas,
Mhm.
but there's some organisms which actually love it, right?
Mhm.
So there would be some creature that would evolve to start consuming, methane or carbon
Yeah.
dioxide, carbon
And
monoxide.
yet, in popular parlance, we think of extinctions as distinct events. So we call the sixth extinction is ongoing. So, what does an extinction mean in that sense if the processes are ongoing? And when we mark something as an extinction event, what do we really mean?
Right, that's a good question, Ravi. See, extinctions happen all the time, right?
Hmm.
I mean, even in the island of Galapagos, since the time of Darwin, although it's rather well preserved and it's protected from extraneous forces. Of course, there's cross greater heat waves and rising tides and those kind of things that are taking place because of things that the island by itself does not manifest upon itself, but it's the larger things that are happening around the world. But having said that, there are extinctions that are taking place even in the most well preserved and conserved and well studied forests. And the reason is this: there is an evolutionary fate which is absolutely not decided by the creature itself. It cannot decide that I'm going to survive this, and I mean, there could be individuals that could hang on to life, but that's not your actual evolutionary fate.
Mhm.
um, Background extinction is a reality. The challenge just now for us is that ecosystems are collapsing.
Mhm.
We're seeing that the Western Ghats, for example, or even the northwestern desert, the Thar region, we're seeing a decline in the what is called the beautiful, the grasslands that existed. And it's not just the forces of nature by itself, but also the human agency
Mhm.
and the abuse of exploitation, which is actually reducing the possibility of these communities of creatures that live together.
Mhm.
Those are tearing apart. And I think that's where extinctions are taking place.
Mhm.
Extinctions will take place because ecosystems cease to exist cohesively.
Mhm.
And I think that's what scientists are really worried about.
So it's not just the creature going out of its own ability to continue in existence because of not being able to cope with something or conditions changing. There are events which are triggering this and from outside, which are not normally would be there. I mean, we all talk about the famous one about the dinosaurs disappearing and the meteor hitting somewhere on in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
And how else should we think about that event? Is that really the case that our survival is owing to that particular event? The mammals came to being because that event happened.
Well, see, mammals existed before that.
mm,
So, in fact, our earliest ancestors were mammal-like reptiles that
mm,
existed, 270 million to 252 million years ago, before the greatest extinction that is called the Permian extinction took place.
mhm,
Now, what we know about the Permian extinction is that it left behind ancestors of the reptiles or the reptiles themselves and the mammal-like reptiles. And some of those survivors are the ones who became our earliest ancestors in that sense, right? And they diverged and created, the true mammals, the ones that are placental like us, and those that are egg-laying, which are the platypuses and echnida, and those kind of the ones
mm,
that still live in Australia. So we are able to trace our earliest ancestors, or the ones. I mean, depending on how you want to say ancestor. I mean, where you want to place the pin on the family tree. Uh, but the real question here is that, would an extinction event like the ones of the dinosaurs eradicate or wipe out an entire family of like the dinosaurs? But the fact of the matter is that dinosaurs did live for a very short period of
mm,
time after the big dinosaurs got extinct. So that's one thing that we know.
mm,
There's new evidence that's coming out from Argentina that is showing that beyond the 66 million year period,
mm,
there were some dinosaurs, the small, very tiny dinosaurs, that actually survived, because dinosaurs could be chicken sized to being double decker sized, right?
mm,
So they could be massive, and they could be very tiny. Uh, and I think the greatest success that the dinosaurs left behind are the birds.
mm.
Actually,
True.
birds are relatives of or the descendants of dinosaurs. So
Mhm,
actually, they're all around us, chirping, twittering, and doing what they are. I
mhm,
think I mean, dinosaurs remain the most successful creatures ever to have lived on land,
mhm,
and I don't think that's going to be a record that's going to be easily broken, because we're talking about 200 million years of dominance of the land by
mhm,
a creature, and such fantastic varieties of creatures. I mean,
mhm,
absolutely majestic animals.
mhm,
Pity that we didn't get to see them. Oh, but
mhm.
I mean, of course, we would have never existed in their
Right.
heyday. So.
Now, coming back to the current moment, where we've been all struck for years now with COVID, this new virus, which we don't know what is living, non-living, what it is in a sense. It's between life and death, life and non-life in a
Sure.
sense. But you also talk about it, how we have co-evolved with it. And this is not very apparent to anybody actually, because we've always treated viruses as something which need to be avoided or need to be protected against from. But in your book, you create a completely different set of stories and evidences, which which tell us our very, if I may use the word, entangled relationship to microbes. And you started your this conversation with talking about uh, the microbial life. So, how should we think of these microbes? Because most of us don't even imagine them as something which is, which are part of us.
Well, I think we need to change that opinion.
Mm,
And I think the scientific community is largely to blame for this. I
mm,
think, there are microbes all around us. So,
mm,
like I say in the opening chapter, that each breath that we take, we inhale bacteria and some viruses, and it's a natural process, right?
mhm,
And there is a natural microbiota in our lungs, or in our gut, and everywhere else, skin,
mm,
eyes, everywhere, which actually is something that has evolved with our skin, with the skin, or the organs of our ancestors, right?
mm,
uh, so it's a process in which we actually co-inhabit with one another. So I think at the most basic level, we need to come out and say that we won't be able to live without these microbes. Had
mm,
if they were to cease to exist, we would perhaps have greater difficulty
mm,
in living our normal life. So we
mm,
take them for granted.
mm,
That's the first thing. But I think, like I mentioned also in my book, there is a legacy, a genetic legacy between organisms and us. And if you were to consider viruses to be the simplest creatures in the world, and us being most complex, which is actually a wrong notion to have, but just for simplicity, let's, even if we were to believe that argument, and everything intermediate to that, whether it's the ape ancestor, and before that the ancestor of that ape, and coming down to ferns and mosses and that bacteria and the virus, whichever chain you want to put it in, we've inherited genes that are common to all of these creatures. We have a gene that is common to us with grapes, with mosses, with a fern. I mean, that's it. I mean, these are things that we have inherited, right? The reason why we we diverged from the placental mammal and the mammal-like reptile, which diverged and created placental mammal and non-placental mammal, the egg-laying mammals. Now, that was a viral infection, right? The reason why we have a placental
infection. By infection, you mean it became part of our.
It became part of our DNA.
Yeah.
And it's a protein that actually orchestrates the creation of a placenta. Now, the placenta by itself is an extraneous, a viral protein, right? So you and I, therefore, if we were to actually think about it, are actually creations of a virus or a viral protein, right? So it's a conspiracy of a kind by nature. To actually use a protein that enables the creation of, if you want to use the word superior or more complex creatures, then the virus actually is orchestrating. It's the mastermind. And billions of years ago, rather not billions, but about 272 million years ago, to be precise, when the first placental creatures emerged, the viruses had actually embedded themselves in that. And there have been successive viral invasions, but they've created the same protein or similar proteins in every creature that became placental, right? So I think there are three levels in which we need to understand the microbial world. One is that they are within us, embedded in our genes, and there's nothing we can do about them. Second is that they are going to colonize us whether we like it or not, whether they crawl over our skin, get into our gut, and they have a service that they're providing there. Of course, they're gaining something out of it as well, but they provide us an unlimited array of services, which we are not told about, right? The third thing is that they're orchestrating the entire ecosystem around us, whether it's they prevent water bodies from going astray. We are throwing in so much sewage into our water bodies, but you seldom see them, smelling or rotting for month over month. I mean, the Yamuna does reek sometimes, of course it does, but there are times when these organisms, reach a balance and say, okay, we're going to clear this. I mean, of course, it's not a directed process. It's not a conscious process. But those are the balancing processes that the organisms themselves are working towards, because they want to maintain that ecosystem so that it becomes a perpetual source of energy and nutrition for them. Right? They're not doing a service to us by keeping the foul smell or the floating masses of algae that you see on top. It occurs only for a few weeks, like I said, but it's that fact that they are able to, correct the imbalances that we are putting in there is an incredible thing. I think that's the service that we now need to look at, both within our bodies, the ecosystems that are there within our body, as well as those outside. And I think without the microbial world, it is not going to be easy to reset the changes that we have made in the ecosystem, whether it's climatic changes, ecosystem changes, and ecosystems of varieties. I think those are things that need the support of everything from microbes and above. If you were to rule out microbes and you think they were going to colonize on their own, well, they could and they might. But the fact is, they are an integral part of it. And I don't think we can miss out any of those pieces when we are planning for anything that we want to do in order to rewild the world and reconstitute or reimagine the landscapes that existed in the way they did.
So it sort of makes you wonder what is them and what is us, because if we are all in this together, then where are the boundaries of them and us? And we of course think like this as them and us, and but we don't think of them as that they are us kind of thing. And it's a big conceptual leap for us to then imagine a world where our boundaries of the self are more porous because of the constant interaction and the constant, the way our bodies function is functioning in these complex interactions. You talk about the gut also in your book, which is such a critical part of our body's energy absorption system.
Sure.
So how did we, why, I mean, this is sort of a jump, but why have we started thinking of human species exclusion to the evolutionary pathway and to the multi-species inhabitations, which you talk about in such detail?
I
What
think
happened?
that's a good question. I think, I don't know where the divergences happen. I think, there are several periods in the time when how we look at medicine, for example, and therefore our own bodies, or how we look at agriculture, and therefore how we want to harvest and tend the natural environment. So I think that the us and them became a very critical part of how medicine was evolving, or how veterinary sciences or agriculture and everything evolved, right? So there were creatures that were preventing us from achieving our full potential in terms of whether it's our own lifespans, or harvesting of agriculture, or getting the most milk or eggs or whatever. There was something that was out there that was going to kill these creatures that we were tending, or our own bodies for that matter. So there were emergence of these pathogens, as we want to call them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these are creatures that give us pathos, right? They give us pain, and they're there out to, the fact that we call them.
That's the word, where the genesis of the word pathogen, etymology.
Absolutely. I mean, they give us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the idea is that, all organisms are there to give us problems. I mean, they're there. I mean, we know there's some of them lurking in our bodies, and we don't know what they're there for. But, we really did not find out ways in which they could well be protective, right? And it's only now that it's dawning upon us that, this organism that is lurking, and we don't know why it's there. And it's then, say, the majority of human population. And I talk about this in my book in a chapter called Invaders and Sentinels.
Yes.
I there are creatures, there are viruses that are lurking in our body, but they're protecting us from other viruses, because they have a lock and key arrangement, and they kind of protect us from the entry or invasion of a real pathogen. So they are there, inside us, because they want in some way, or directly or indirectly, protecting us from other viral infections. Again, like I say, it's not a directed process. It's not a conscious process that this virus has actually done us a favor. But the fact is that our scientific community has not either looked into this carefully and wanted to find the answers. And when it found the answers, it did not want to communicate it to the public. I find it a little annoying that the scientific community does not want to answer questions, because the whole problem is that there is a utility function that we want to assign to every creature around us, right? So even more charismatic species, like say the tiger, we want to protect the tiger because it's going to protect the ecosystem. And why do we want to protect the ecosystem? Because it gives us biodiversity benefits. It gives us water, downstream, better water, less soil erosion. It's going to protect the forest and all of that. But would you not do it for other creatures if you don't have a charismatic creature, right? And they would be, say, Why should you protect a place like, say, the wetlands or the Mystica swamplands of the Western Ghats, right? There's no charismatic species there. I mean, you've got a few hornbills and a few other creatures. I mean, there are some primates there, but there's no charismatic species. But it has an incredible value when it comes to regulating so many other things. And I think uh, we have to stop assigning these values to biodiversity and saying each species has intrinsic link to the ecosystem or to other creatures. We do not know these equations. Let's be humble and say we do not understand it yet. And there is nothing that needs to be conserved more or eradicated. I think this whole problem with eradication is problematic because I mean, of course, things like smallpox and rinderpest are exclusively creatures that affect only one terminal. They've reached the terminal where they only infect one set of creatures, right? Or in case of smallpox, it's just us. Or in case of measles, it's just us, right? So it is only in our self-interest that we want to eradicate measles, and it does not really contribute to biodiversity or does not engage with other species, right? At least that's what we understand about it. I mean, that's what we think it is. Now, having said that, I think we have to be a little conscious about how we want to look at biodiversity and conservation strategies in the future, because I think it now impinges on how we want to assign values. The classic problem remains with should all bats be eradicated? I mean, this is a conversation that was happening in 2017, 18, and 19 in Kerala, that should fruit bats which carry Nipah, should we just eliminate them? I mean, you have no Nipah, right? But that's not going to solve your problem. That's the first thing. The second thing is we need to understand how species or pathogens jump. We need to understand those conditions rather than saying let's eliminate the reservoir or the vector or something like that. I don't think it's going to help you. Right? So I think we need to step back and understand the utility function, but in a broader sense. And I think we should actually we should not call it the utility function. We should call it something else. It's something that has been used by the 1970s, 80s biologists, especially people like Richard Dawkins. I mean, he called it the God's utility function. Of course, that was he was talking about something else, but I think that phrase has got picked up and it's being misused or mislabeled as it's being used by biologists across the world, or now even policymakers, that there's a utility function for the species. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, who are we to assign it? And in hindsight, we realize that there's so many things that have gone extinct or the numbers have reduced, and because of which ecosystems tend to collapse. And I think that's
so the question, of course, I mean, this opens up a host of questions and a host of inquiries, which probably are not easy to answer. But the question is, if science by ascribing a utility function to any living thing makes a decision based on that, but then it's also being counterproductive because of the host of other functions which it's not seeing. And how does it serve science not to see that? Because it's like the immune system. What triggers that off, in a sense? Should you be completely in a bubble, or should you be in real life to develop a healthy immune system? So if you take away things you don't understand or have not investigated, how is that productive to a scientist or to actually protecting life in a larger frame of things? And why should we not think of life in its wider interactions, such as what you describe in viruses and how they've co-formed with us?
right.
Why would we? Is that not counterproductive and counterintelligent?
Not at all. Actually, by understanding a swathe of life, and by having a deeper, a more meaningful understanding of how creatures interact,
Yeah.
and how they actually react to different conditions, and react not only individually, but also with creatures that they interact with or life forms that they work around with. I think that's something that we need to understand because, for example, look at fire climax forests, right? I mean, you have some in the Himalayas, you've got an artificially created fire climax forest in the deciduous forests of India, where you do, pluck tendu, burn the forest and let it grow, and tendu becomes the dominant species, which in nature perhaps would have not been the case. You would still have the regeneration after a couple of decades by sal or teak, because those are the pioneers. They are the dominant species. The challenge is that we have manipulated ecosystems and environments so deeply just to suit ourselves. And I think, again, by putting that notional value to a single set of species or a set of ecosystems, I think we do that at our own peril, because imagine this, that you have a massive wildlife trade taking place across borders in Southeast Asia. And of course, even in India and Africa, you have bushmeat consumption across the world. Most continents still have it. Now, why should a species cross over now? Why should it cross over from humans, from a reservoir, perhaps a civet cat or a bat, into humans, and from humans goes to tigers and to minks and weasels, and now SARS-CoV-2, which was originated somewhere in Southeast Asia, is now found in Denmark and Hungary and in mink farms. This kind of evolutionary opportunity, which otherwise would have not taken place, because there's no teleconnection between the forests of Southeast Asia with, say, the cold Nordic mink farms, where these creatures are completely unrelated. Yeah. But it's the speed at which we create these equations without even understanding the broader implications. So, are we therefore driving extinction of creatures by giving or creating these opportunities? Because we don't know the evolutionary fate of what's going to happen to SARS-CoV-2 or whatever it's going to be called as it emerges in minks, and is it going to come back into the Nordic population? It gets released again in a more lethal form. We don't know. And are we going to play God because of the liberties that we want to take with nature? Those are the larger questions that you have to ask. So I think I'm sidestepping your real question here, but because it's not an easy question to answer.
I know.
I think what I have a problem with is that there's going to be a conversation 20 or 30 years down the line. And I think it's going to be this. It's going to be a little controversial, and you might be editing this when you put it up, but let me say this. So think about it. We have a cup of coffee, and we have grown coffee which has left the coffee forests of Ethiopia, which are beautiful forests. I mean, they're just so lovely. They're absolutely gorgeous forests. But they've left, the seed left from there came to India and went to Indonesia and went all across the world. So you've got Brazilian coffee, you've got Colombian coffee. I mean, they just don't grow there. And the same thing happened with chocolate. The same thing happened with just about every cash crop that we grow. We are decimating forests in Kunur and Kodagu and in Sarawak and in Java and in Bali, all those lovely lush tropical forests just to have a coffee or a tea or a chocolate. I could go on, right? Now, the real reward to the communities or the locations that actually produced the original crop or protected them or used them, that we are not assigning any value to that, right? And we are happy that the deforestation happens for things like coffee. We don't have any qualms about coffee and chocolate and or tea. The upper Assam forests are gone, but who cares, right? But we have problems for things like palm oil. So how are you weighing this in?
Right.
And how do you assign values, economic or otherwise, or biodiversity values versus otherwise? So should humans in the future decide to say, hey, listen, we are going to buy only tea from China because that's the point of origin, and let's all be willing to pay a hefty price for it. And
Mm-hmm.
let's buy things like chocolate from Mexico and Guatemala. And
Mm-hmm.
let's buy a coffee only from. But this is a radical thought. And I know we are not going to be able to do it. But in all fairness to nature,
Mm-hmm.
this would have been the right way to do it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Not take species across, because we did the Columbian exchange many times over now,
Yeah.
and we all blame the Columbian exchange to
Mm-hmm.
be the trigger
Mm-hmm.
for the massive globalization of and the movement of
Absolutely. And of course, I'm not going to edit anything because I not only because I'm not going to as a principal, but because I think this, I agree with you fully that that this assignment uh, of selective values and selective utilities is actually making us blinded to a larger set of questions which we don't put a value to or don't put a utility to, and hence just ignore. But it also, since you're a scientist, and I want to know that firstly, what kind of questions can science ask, uh, which brings us out of this conundrum of this: we have to kill COVID, we have to kill the next version of COVID, we have to inoculate. Of course, that's how you'll deal with the crisis. But what kind of questions can science ask to make us see this picture in a different way?
I think that's a difficult question because the problems are multifaceted. Like, for example, the most obvious thing should have been is that we needed stronger controls put into CITES. Now, CITES
Yeah.
and the larger wildlife trade groups have not convened.
Mhm.
There was initial demand to reduce wildlife trade, but I don't think it's got the political
Traction.
or even the market impetus that it required. So I think
Mhm.
that's a chronic problem, because there's is not just SARS-CoV-2. There's several others waiting in the wing.
Right.
So
I was
and
going to
we
come to
know,
that, but
yeah. I
yeah,
mean, they're waiting there. I mean,
yeah.
there's an
I
infinite.
know, I know you know much more than you want to say, but
Sure.
because you are actually right there in the middle of all this through your own
Right.
work. Otherwise, yeah,
Right. I mean, there are mysterious fevers happening all
yeah,
across,
yeah.
even as we speak. So I don't think, I mean, it's just that I mean, it's the human agency that actually will further the evolutionary ambitions, if I can use that word. I
Yeah.
mean, it's wrong, but the virus or any pathogen does not have that intent. But having said that, I think it's entirely dependent on us, because we are the dominant creatures and we have the wide networks and teleconnections that are going to actually move them faster, and
Yeah.
all those kind of things. Uh, but the problem is, how should science look at it? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the fundamental question,
I
right?
mean, the question was also, sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
how can science think of us as co-evolved and cohabited as part of a wider set of networks of ecological networks in which we are based? Because I think part of our problem is that, I mean, we're not even aware of these complexities in which we are located.
Sure.
And coming from your first comments about we being in a point in time that we are so young,
Sure.
that the birds are 70,000 years old. And
Right.
so it's a constantly evolving situation,
Right.
and there's no necessity that we will survive this or we need to survive this. Just evolution has not ensured any such thing
Sure.
in
I
life.
mean, we don't come with a gate pass, right?
We don't come with a gate pass. So then to think, how do we as intelligent people who will
Right. So,
think about this separately as even a survival question?
right. I think the questions that I think it's more complex, because I
Yeah.
mean, let me just give you an example that I was uh, just last week, sorry, 2 weeks ago, we were discussing the World Water Day, and it was the
Yeah.
theme this year was groundwater, and how
Yeah.
water, it's a resource that needs to be exploited. And I said,
Yeah.
"Are you guys kidding me?
Mm,
Groundwater is something that you should not touch." Now, the premise of groundwater exploitation
mm,
started with the idea that sometimes rivers are fickle and lakes and ponds drain out. So there is water inside layers of rocks, right? I mean, pervious or impervious rocks. They tend to store subterranean water. That's the argument that was there. There was a second argument that came up in the 40s and 50s as Africa and Southeast Asia, especially India, had a big problem with diarrhea. The argument was this, that the organisms that cause diarrhea are not found in groundwater, which of course was a myth, but to some extent that's true, but it's not entirely true. So we started to dig bore wells, right? And we discarded the use of ponds and lakes and streams and all of that. If you remember, I mean, in my childhood, I don't know about yours, there were ponds. I mean, I learned to swim in a stream and a pond. I mean, there is not a stream or a pond left in Western UP. I mean, Western UP had water chestnut and such delightful things that would come from the pond itself, right? I mean, you had kamal kakri, lotus stem, for example. It's now a thing of the past. It's a rarity. I mean,
you don't find kamal kakri in the vegetable cellar anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think it's now seen as an exotic thing, right? Yeah. And the same thing as water chestnut. I mean, this winter or the previous,
you hardly find them.
Yeah. I mean, we used to have a flour made out of water chestnut.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Yeah. And so the thing is, the extinction of lakes and ponds and streams and our over dependence on groundwater, I think, is counterproductive for many reasons.
But you also bought arsenic and fluoride and all these other.
Well, again, that's the utility function, right?
Yeah,
I mean, but let's look at it from the larger ecological perspective. We led to extinction of so many species. After Brazil, India had the most freshwater fish in the world. With the introduction of bore wells, and also another calamitous thing that happened was that we were fighting malaria. So we introduced exotic fish that could eat malarial
eggs.
I mean, mosquito eggs, larvae and stuff like that. And that also, once the malaria season was over, they started to feed on the fish eggs, right?
Right.
And as a result, there's been a massive decline in fish population in India, right?
Wow.
So, those kind of things have not been, looked at when you see the larger perspective of how ecosystems have responded in India, right? And so you have the imbalances like fluoride and arsenic, like you said, but these are the manifestations, and there are several other manifestations which we don't link to what ponds and, ponds and lakes are things that emerge because of the geology, right? Why does a pond exist in a certain place? It's not just because there's a depression on the surface of land that it just accumulates there. That's not the only thing. There's got to be a bedrock which actually keeps it afloat, right?
Right.
The water has to deposit there. There's got to be a clay layer which has got deposited over a few hundred years or 1,000 years, and only then will it start becoming into a lake or a pond. So I'm kind of livid. I mean, I'm sorry I'm bringing this up, but I find that many of these days, especially the World Water Day this year, were absolutely counterproductive. We should have called, or at least argued with people who believe, especially people like me. I'm in a minority here because nobody in the group that I was in with believed or thought the way that I was thinking. That,
amazing.
There are benefits of ponds, and they didn't even see that.
Amazing.
A World Water Day where they're talking about conserving ponds and lakes and streams and wetlands. They're not talking about that. They're talking about supplying sustained amount of water to cities in the world. Right? That's the central argument. Right? And I find that to be extremely counterproductive to the whole climate argument, water crisis that we are about to face, soil depletion, carbon storage in soils. I mean, we're looking. So I think all of this is linked.
Yeah.
And the other challenge is that the agencies, the larger agencies that are at play here, whether it's the UNDP or the UNEP or all of them are perhaps not the most wise of agencies when it comes to looking at the interplay of ecosystems. Don't think they understand the large scheme of things. And I've been very critical about the IPCC. I mean, they don't talk about, there are very few geologists, for example, and as a result, there is very little representation of people who actually can come up with solutions
Mhm.
to reversing climate change or improving the mitigation strategies. And I think this is
So,
the important challenge.
given this dismal picture, which actually I share, have been speaking about also, um, uh, and it completely plays into what the Anthropocene is saying,
Sure.
the anthropocentrization of everything, of all our relationships to everything, including the questions which science asks of nature, of things around us. Um, but I believe there's a shift possible with the kind of work you do, the kind of questions you bring up in your writings, the kind of worlds you expose to us, uh, whether we want to see them or not, but you are saying it. You are saying that we are living in this complexity, and these complexities are actually our life force, if you want to use that word. And
Sure.
when you take some plugs out of them, you don't know what's going to drain out, and
Right.
what futures are we going to see, what is leading to what, because everything is interlinked in a sense. The oxygen we breathe is interlinked to the bacteria you talk about,
That's right.
and our bodies are interlinked with the viruses through the placentas and the guts, and how we live our daily lives and how we
Sure.
reproduce in a sense. And you're also saying that we are not, there's no guarantee that we are going to be here in the future, because life has not never guaranteed that to anything, though
For
life
any
will go
people.
on, but we will be go on. There's no
Sure.
guarantees, but we plod along. So the question comes back to me: how, what are, if we had the possibility of focusing light on what should we focusing on for the questions of sustainability, and outside the sustainable development goals, outside the UN convention, outside all of these, if we as wise, intelligent race want to see futures, what are the questions we should be asking today? And where should we be focusing, irrespective of whether it's possible politically or not? But where should we, as wise people, be focusing to? What should we be acknowledging,
No, I
in a
think
much bigger way?
again, you're putting me in a spot here. But my
Really?
fundamental question is that
Yeah.
when I talk to scientists, and
Mm.
I try being as humble as I can, but I
Yeah.
get a little aggressive.
Mm.
And I'm a biochemist by training, and
Yes.
I'm kind of I understand pathogens. I mean, or the microbial world. Let not say. I mean, I work in public health, so I use the word pathogen, but I
Yeah.
actually love the microbial world. So
Yeah.
I absolutely love what we think is gunk, slime, germ, critter, anything, those kind of labels that we give to those creatures is something which I find absolutely appalling. And I've been writing to editors of very many journals saying that it does not do you any good by calling a creature, by some, derogatory name. But leaving that aside, I think for me, the question to every scientist is this, that how do you know this? And what is
Yeah.
your, when you speak in standard deviation and error percentages, how sure are you that there is no other phenomena in play? You know,
Yeah.
and then I keep asking questions that, have you considered this? Have you looked at this? Have you looked at this? And that's when they start saying, oh no, this is not, or this is not a scenario that is possible, or this is not. And eventually it does become possible, right?
Yeah.
And for example, in my book, I think you alluded to it in the first question when you were talking about dinosaurs.
Yeah.
The Deccan lava flow was so massive. It created a subterranean continent now, which exists in the Indian Ocean, about the size of uh, Spain, France, and Portugal put together, because
Yeah.
only the Spain size is on the landmass in India, right?
Yeah.
But now, a lot of people were critical when I said that, this volcanic activity would have had some implications on the plant life, because, we're creating a mild nuclear winter with the ash that's coming out from the Deccan lava flow. And as a result, the tall araucarias and all those kind of trees would have started to diminish, and therefore the large plant-eating dinosaurs would have kind of whittled out, right? I mean,
Yeah.
only the smaller ones would have, over 100,000 years or a million years. That's the process that would have happened. So there would have been a gradual decline of the massive dinosaurs, and not just the plant eaters, but also
Right.
the meat eaters who depended on them, right?
Right.
But the kind of flack that I faced, because there's one proven theory that the nail in the coffin was the meteor that fell, the asteroid that hit, fell near close to Mexico, and I think that's done and dusted. So people don't want to open it up again. So my question to them is: so did the Deccan lava flow, which outpoured for about 3 million years, have no implications on the world's on life as we know it?
Yeah.
And to my mind, because if
3 million years, the Deccan lava flow, and it forms the whole Deccan plateau, right?
Absolutely.
The black soil.
Massive. Yeah, it's a massive piece of
massive event.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a massive landscape, right?
Yeah.
So surely it had, and again, India was at that time not right up north or down south. It was just south of the equator.
Right.
So it would have navigated across the entire globe in a sense that the ash and the cloud, the volcanic cloud that was created, would have been massive, right? So I think counterfactual is something that scientists hate to do. This is where I think geographers and historians and political scientists tend to do this very beautifully.
Right.
They do not like to question something which is posited by another discipline of science.
Yeah.
Right? For example, I mean, let me give you another example. It's a very interesting question that I ask children, that if you take a normal bottle of water, tap water, you take water that you've taken from the fridge, and you take a bottle of hot water.
Yeah.
You put it in the freezer.
Yeah.
Right? Or put it in a container. Don't put it in a bottle, because the bottle might crack. Because if you put hot water in it, right, in your freezer, it's going to actually burst open. But if you were to take it and put it in, say, a steel glass, a tumbler, right, which one do you think is going to freeze first, right? And that's a question that I ask all the time, right? And most people say, oh, it's going to be the cold water that's going to freeze first. But the answer is, it's going to be hot
water is freeze
right?
first.
Now, this was an effect which is called the Pemba Effect. It was by a Tanzanian boy who had this project to make ice cream, and he didn't have the time to cool down his ice cream. You have to whip your ice cream. This is a school project, right? And he just whipped it quickly in hot water, and he came late to class, or something happened, and he put it just the way it was. And everybody was saying, oh, you came late to class, you would have failed this project. And lo and behold, his ice cream came out the best, right? And people were amazed, and they couldn't understand that he put hot water, and the mixture was warm, and stuff like that. So the question is, even today, the best physicist or even biochemist or chemists or anybody in this field of science cannot tell you the real reason why hot water freezes faster than, say, normal water or cold water, right? Now, these are things which I kind of find amazing, that if there is a person who teaches physics or say material science or geology or biochemistry or whatever, and water is integral to teach all these things, right? And if that's not happening, and if you don't have an answer, I mean, either you should be really humble and say, yeah, I really don't know an answer to that, right? And that's fine, absolutely. I mean, most people don't know answers to everything, right? I mean, in fact, it's best to stay ignorant, but the fact is, have the humility to say that I don't know. Okay? And I think scientists increasingly have forgotten this. And if the other thing, Ravi, what is very interesting is that the great scientists of the 17th and the 18th and the 19th and the early 20th century were polymaths, right? They learned things from, I mean, Darwin, as we know, was
observation.
Observation, but learning from other disciplines, right? I mean, and you would say, oh, if this happens in that case, perhaps this happens here as well. And Darwin, as you know, was very inspired by his grandfather and was in love with geology.
Right.
And there's so many other people. I mean, I was reading Peter Turchin's amazing work on history, the rise and fall of empires, and he's an ecologist. He looks at pine beetles in forests, and he's been able to look at what causes mighty forests to succumb, or trees, juvenile and old trees,
Right.
to succumb to pine beetle infestation, and he's been able to come up with some extraordinary theories by just studying the mathematics and the biology
Yeah.
of beetles in forests and use that to explain the rise and fall of empires or what events triggered.
Yeah.
I find that absolutely elegant. I think
Yeah.
that elegance in science
Yeah.
is missing.
Right. Well, on that note, Pranay, it's been an hour we've been speaking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating array of questions which open up. And I think what is really important is to open up the inquiries of what we don't know into the certainty of what we know,
Sure.
because I think that really is the bulk of the landscape. Even in our cosmic inquiries about what this universe is and where we are, in just in terms of where it started, where it ends, what are black holes, what are white holes, what there's so little we know, and
Sure.
we move as if we do. And I think the other thing which is very important, which comes across from your questionings and your storytelling and your scientific storytelling, is this idea of ecosystems. That it's not necessarily that we know everything, but that ecosystems are complex places. Like when you talk of the Deccan lava flow and what impact it has on life and the unanswered questions around that, that these are whole ecosystem changes which are taking place are so complex, and that the micro and the macro, if you want to use the word, are intertwined in ways we don't fully understand or not able to explain. And even if you look at the phenomena of quantum physics and classical physics and how they cannot explain each other, how classical physics cannot fully explain the phenomena of quantum physics.
Sure.
So these inexplicable questions, which are interlocked in our state of being,
Sure.
open up the question of the interdisciplinary, which you refer to very elegantly when you're talking about even Charles Darwin, uh, about how science has become from polymath to this utilitarian thing. But the crux of inquiry is a complex process and should not be contained. That's the crux of of even the questions which we think of when we talk of uh, a world which is where the human is decentered from the way we know it to a multi-species world.
Sure.
And that's what really draws me to your fascinating line of inquiries in your books and this conversation is this what we need to open up now, I think. And of course, there are no clear answers, but one thing is quite clear, that it's much more complicated than what we assume it to be. And what you said in the middle, are we causing our own extinction? It could very well be true
That's true.
in a sense. So on that note, I would just like to thank you very much for this fascinating 1 hour. I could speak to you and I hope I'm able to speak to you on an ongoing conversation on the one walk we've been on and the many walks I hope to take with you.
Absolutely.
Not only physical but also intellectual walks, to have many more fascinating conversations with you. So I'd just like to thank you on that note, Pranay, for
Thank you
being
for
so
having me.
generous with your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting me.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Ravi.